The idea of voting, of actually having a say in how you're governed, we kind of take it for granted today, right? But where did that even come from? Well, it's an idea that literally changed the world. And to find its roots, we've got to go back, way back, to ancient Greece. This is where a totally radical concept of self-government was born.
So, for pretty much all of human history before this, power was a top down thing. It was simple. It came straight from the heavens. You had kings, you had emperors, and they ruled because, well, the gods said so. End of story. But the Greeks? Oh, they had a completely different idea. They started thinking, what if we had a say? They imagined a system where free people, okay, let's be real, free adult males at the time, could actually participate in their own governance. This was a massive, game-changing shift. You weren't just a subject anymore, you were a citizen.
So you might be asking, how does an idea that radical even get started? Well, it all begins with a total collapse. I'm talking about the great Mycenaean kingdoms. These were the big players, with powerful kings and massive palaces. And then they just crumbled. Nobody's 100% sure why, but it was out of that chaos, out of those ashes, that something completely new finally had the room to grow.
And for a while after that collapse, things were pretty tough. Greece entered what historians call the Dark Ages. But here's the thing, it wasn't the end, not by a long shot. It was more like hitting the reset button. Because around 800 BCE, a kind of renaissance started to spark all across the land. This period, the Archaic period, was the real dawn of everything we think of as classical Greece. So as they're coming out of this darkness, these Greek communities start trying new things. They start experimenting. Instead of just having one king calling all the shots, citizens, actual citizens, started voting on laws, on taxes. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. For the first time, ordinary people had a direct hand in building the world they lived in. It was absolutely revolutionary.
Now, this whole new idea of self-rule didn't just pop up in some big unified kingdom. No, that's not how it happened. Instead, it blossomed in hundreds of tiny, independent communities. You can almost think of them like little political laboratories, each one trying out its own unique experiment in government. We call them the city-states.
And the fundamental building block of this Greek world was the polis. Now, a polis, it wasn't just a city. You got to understand it was a whole world unto itself. Each one was completely independent. It had its own government, its own laws, its own army, even its own special relationship with the gods. Your identity wasn't just Greek. No, you were an Athenian, or you were a Spartan, or a Corinthian. That was who you were. And here's what's so wild about it. All these city-states, they were fiercely competitive. I mean, they were constantly fighting each other. And yet, they were all connected by this invisible thread. They all called themselves Hellens. They spoke the same language. They worshipped the same gods, like Zeus and Apollo. And they would even put their wars on hold to compete together at the Olympic Games. So they were bitter rivals, for sure, but they were also kind of like a big dysfunctional family.
Okay, so you've got this whole world of hundreds of these little city-states, but out of all of them, two absolute titans rose to the top. Two rivals with completely opposite ideas about how a society should run. And their rivalry would basically define Greek politics for centuries to come. You know who I'm talking about. Athens and Sparta.
You couldn't get two places more different if you tried. On one hand, you have Athens, the birthplace of democracy, just buzzing with art, philosophy, and trade, a hub of new ideas. And on the other hand, Sparta, the polar opposite. It was an oligarchy, which just means it was ruled by a tiny, powerful group. Their entire society was basically a finely tuned military machine, with one single, all-consuming goal: create the perfect soldier. And the heart of this Spartan system was something called the agoge. It was this incredibly brutal state-run training program, and it really shows you just how extreme they were. Just try to wrap your head around this. At 7 years old, 7, you're taken from your family and raised entirely by the state. From that moment forward, your whole life has one purpose: become a soldier. It was an unbelievably harsh system, but man, it worked. It created the most feared warriors in the entire ancient world. So, while Sparta is busy perfecting its military machine, what's happening back in Athens? Well, things are not going so great. The city was basically about to tear itself apart. The gap between the rich and the poor had gotten so massive that Athens was teetering right on the brink of a full-blown civil war. It was going to take someone special to pull them back from the edge. Yeah, the situation was absolutely explosive.
You had poor farmers getting buried deeper and deeper in debt to the super wealthy elite. So first they'd lose their farm, then they'd lose their freedom, literally being sold into slavery just to pay off their debts. Think about that. Athenian citizens were enslaving other Athenian citizens. The whole city was a powder keg, just waiting for a spark.
So, to stop the whole thing from blowing up, the Athenians turned to one man, a guy named Solon, and they basically gave him emergency powers to fix it. And he didn't waste any time. He came in with a radical plan. First thing he does, boom, all debts are canceled. Imagine the relief for the poor. Next, he bans debt slavery forever. And maybe most important of all, he creates new bodies, like the Council of 400 and jury courts, ways for regular citizens to actually have a voice.
Now, was this a full-blown democracy? Not quite, but what Solon did was absolutely huge. His reforms completely shattered the old system where only the fancy aristocratic families had any power. Suddenly, it wasn't just about who your grandfather was, it was about wealth. And that opened the door for a whole new class of people to get involved in government. It was a massive step forward for Athens.
So, just as the Greeks are working all this stuff out, these totally different ways of running a city, a massive threat appears on the horizon. I'm talking about the biggest empire the world had ever seen. And all these squabbling rival city-states were suddenly faced with a very simple, very stark choice: unite or get wiped off the map. And the spark that lit the fuse came in 499 BCE. A bunch of Greek cities over in Ionia, that's in modern-day Turkey, revolted against their Persian overlords. And Athens sent some ships to help them out. To the Persian king, Darius, this was a massive insult, a direct challenge to his authority, and he was not about to let it slide. He was going to answer, and he was going to answer with everything he had.
And that one act kicked off a whole series of historic invasions. First, King Darius sent an army, but the Athenians famously beat them at the Battle of Marathon. So, 10 years later, his son Xerxes comes back for revenge with a gigantic army and navy. This is when you get the legendary stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. The bottom line is, the Greeks were up against insane odds, fighting for their homes, their freedom, and these brand new ideas about government. Facing total destruction, these city-states, these fierce rivals who were always at each other's throats, they did the unthinkable. They teamed up. They formed something called the Hellenic League, an alliance that was basically a greatest hits of the Greek world. Sparta, with its unmatched army, took command on land, and Athens, with its powerful navy, took command of the sea. It was the ultimate team-up. And their victory, well, it was a turning point for all of world history. It really makes you stop and think, right? What would our world even look like today if they had lost? Because by defending their own little city-states, their own freedom, they saved something much, much bigger. They saved an idea, the idea that people can and should govern themselves, an idea that's still shaping our world thousands of years later.